The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Music Biz Common Ground webinar series. I'm Nicole Hennessy, Vice President of Music Biz. Happy to have you all here today and happy to have the Audiomonitor presentation back on the webinar series. AudienceNet has been a partner of ours for many years, and we're glad to bring back and share the research that they have. But before we do that, just a few housekeeping things that I wanted to alert you to from the association. Our call for presentations for Music Biz 2020 is open. So if you have well thought out, fleshed out program panel ideas that you would like to have considered for Music Biz 2020, you can submit those. If you go to musicbiz2020.com, you'll see a link there for the call for presentations, and that will give you guidelines and submission instructions. The submission deadline is December 2nd. So if you do have any questions about submitting a panel or a presentation for Music Biz 2020, feel free to give me a yell. It's nicole.hennessy@musicbiz.org. We'll have a number of announcements about the 2020 annual convention coming up soon. So be on the lookout for those. Registration is open and can also be found at musicbiz2020.com. But before the annual conference, we have another conference, a 2-day business development summit called Nylon Connect 2020. It's a global conference of about 200 decision makers from the global music industry coming together at the beginning of the year to talk about the issues at hand and chart the course for the next 365 days. Great program so far. I may be a little biased, but I definitely believe it's one of our best to date. We have keynote speakers, including Cecilia Viss from Spotify, Scott Cohen from Warner Music Group, Troy Carter, now at Q&A, Sun Lee, who is from YouTube, representing their Korea and China market. So a very diverse lineup of speakers, and you can check out more about that event at nylonconnect.com. And then our virtual series that's on here today. We have a number of webinars still on the docket for the rest of the year, including Hit Songs Deconstructed, Legacy Entertainment Ventures, Live Music Royalty, JAXTA, Vistex, and Think Tank. So visit the events tab at musicbiz.org to find out more about what those webinars will focus on and also to register for those. Today's presentation, as I said, we have AudienceNet. We have Sania and Isaac with us. There is a questions box on the screen. Feel free to ask questions of the presenters as the webinar is going on. They will answer those questions as time allows. It's a great way to dig a little bit deeper into the data that they're presenting to you. So feel free to ask those burning questions in that questions box. Sania and Isaac, thank you so much for returning to the webinar series. We're so glad to have you here. I'm excited to hear this data today because it's always very informative for not only me here at Music Biz, but our members at large. So thank you for being here. I'm going to put us on mute and turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicole. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. So yeah, I'm Sania. I'm head of research at AudienceNet, and I have Isaac with me, who is a research manager with us. Hopefully many of you are aware of our work at AudienceNet, but for those that aren't, just a quick introduction. So we're a consumer and social research company and cover a range of sectors, but largely our sort of specialism is in music and entertainment. So we work with labels, streaming services, music tech companies, but also importantly with governments or governing bodies looking at things like, how to reduce copyright infringement, etc. So that's us. And in terms of Audiomonitor, we've obviously been doing that for some time now, and very much value our partnership with Music Biz and getting the opportunity to present results to everyone. This year, as the name suggests of the webinar, it's expanded, but also it's a little revamped. So there are a few questions where we've sort of taken a slightly different look at them, inspired by the other work that we do in music. So hopefully it'll all be of use. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Okay, in terms of what we're covering, so got a range of things, quite a bit to get through, but there are some definite kind of dominant storylines throughout the research that we're kind of keen to draw everyone's attention to. So hopefully it won't be overwhelming in any way, but useful. And if there's anything else that you want to cover or discuss, like feel free to A, asking the questions, or B, get in touch with us afterwards. So broadly, there's a few sections particularly on music, so a bit of context around music engagement. Then we dive deep into the consumption habits before going on to a few new topics, sort of some very close to our heart in terms of music and mental health, world music, and also we'll be looking at podcasts. So quickly, just to start off, our sample is representative of the US population, 16 plus, based off US Census data, and data is literally fresh off the press. We have run the survey this month, and this year, you may have noticed, sort of brought down our sample from 3,000 closer to the 2,000 mark, which is what we tend to do in a lot of other US music studies. So that's the kind of only difference there in terms of sampling, but still very much robust numbers, enabling us to look at cross breaks and in particular look at age breakdowns, which are pretty prominent as one of our sort of storylines as we go through. So to start off with, music engagement. So this is a little bit new, a little bit expanded in terms of what we want. So for context, first of all, so what do people do in terms of entertainment, and how does music feature within this? So good news being that the top two things that people do on a typical day are view social media and listen to music. And then we've also got watching TV and movies is also a prominent activity. And one of our kind of key storylines here is the sort of digital and then the offline listening. So here with music and TV, TV and films, you can see that there is engagement across online streaming, but also terrestrial TV. And we start to see that difference very much for the younger age groups engaging with those categories online, and the older age groups more so through terrestrial. Means video games is a really interesting one. It's a lot higher amongst younger groups, but actually it sustains all the way up to 44. So over half of our sample who are age 16 to 44 engage in video games on a typical day, compared to 43% for the general population. Podcasts, which is what we're going to go on to look at in a little bit more detail slightly later, we've got 18% engagement across the total population, but they're particularly high at 30% amongst young professionals. So that's another sort of one of our stories that we'll get to a little bit later. So when we ask people what their favorite form of entertainment is, of the ones that they engage with on a typical day, movies and TV trumps music slightly, but I mean, that's not anything alarming. It could well be because these are tended to be sort of associated more with relaxation and winding down, whereas music tends to be more of an ongoing activity throughout the day. And that's definitely something that we see in a lot of our other research as well. So there's that. And then also for younger groups, quite interestingly, for 16 to 24-year-olds, we see that video games at 24% are kind of giving quite large competition to watching TV episodes on online streaming services. So they're very much competing for their attention or their love there. Okay, so in terms of passion for music, so what does music mean to people? Why is it so important in their lives? There's a few things here. First of all, it's very important in terms of self-expression, both in terms of creating their own identity, it would seem, and then also expressing that to the wider world, with 57% of people identifying that, and then 45% of people saying it's very much central to their life. Looking at then active engagement, so 39% of people regularly look for new music, with 21% feeling as though they spend a lot of money on music. And across all of these passion categories, we see higher scores for those aged 16 to 44. Okay, just a quick one here on genres. Obviously, there's lots we could do with genres, and previously we presented specifically on these, but this is just a general kind of overview of, so then what are people listening to? And we see, as before, as trends have suggested, rock genres tend to have a slightly older skew in terms of engagement, whereas pop and hip hop / rap, by contrast, tend to be a little bit younger. and distribution across the other genres is generally sort of flatter, consistent across the age groups. All right, going now on to broad music consumption. This is where we dive quite a bit into the detail. So some heavy slides coming up, so I'll be sure to kind of run through them in detail. First thing to say is how long are people listening to music for on a typical day, and 4 is generally the kind of magic number or the average here. So most, so 79%, that's over 3/4 of the sample, listen for up to 4 hours in a day. And in terms of length of listening time, it is actually slightly longer for 16 to 24-year-olds. So we've got a quarter of them spend, or 27% of them spend more than 4 hours a day listening to music. And also it's actually noticeably higher amongst the 45 to 54-year-olds. So amongst the very young, and then kind of as we get to the middle ages, which is quite interesting, middle age groups that we cover. Okay, weekly format reach. So this one is broad format reach. So we're looking here at people on a typical day, people who listen to music on a typical day. Which formats are they listening by? So this is across kind of a range of different ones. So here we have grouped together the online streaming category. That's where we group together on-demand streaming and internet radio. So when we do that, we see that that category here is top. So this is one of the ones that we've looked at slightly differently this year compared to last year, where we were looking at everyone. Here we're just looking at music listeners. So online streaming as a combined category is definitely top. But then if we look down at the individual categories, we see that, again, one of our main storylines here, as has been in the past, is the kind of the neck and neck battle between radio and on-demand streaming. So they're both comparable there at 71 and 70%. And then we have slightly lower down, we have internet radio coming in at 39%, and then digital downloads comparable, with physical format slightly lower down. On the next slide, we break this down in terms of the analysis more so by age groups. So this changes quite considerably, the battle between broadcast radio and on-demand streaming, as we look at the age groups. So as people, as the sample gets older, share of, well, online streaming or on-demand streaming is less used, and then broadcast radio tends to come up. One group where that's really interesting, where it kind of stays, where it's very much comparable, is the 35 to 44-year-olds. So it's 76% for broadcast radio and 75% for on-demand streaming services. So yeah, it's kind of essentially the inverse of the other. Where we'll probably be able to see it a little bit better here is we look at our daily format shares of listening, so where we've got our comparable data across the years, where the storylines generally stayed consistent as well, with on-demand streaming catching up with the share of radio. Just quickly, I should probably explain, for those of you that aren't familiar, the share here is basically of all the time spent listening to music. How is that distributed across the different sources here, or the different formats here? So very much comparable between the two, but this year we can see that increase in on-demand streaming has made it match the score for radio, which suggests that as that trend continues, next year potentially on-demand streaming could surpass, or maybe a few points ahead, if this general trend continues. Okay, and then if we look here again now, this breakdown of share of listening by age, again, the story that I mentioned earlier about the differences between younger people and the formats that dominate their listening versus the older sample. So we can see here very much so the red bar for on-demand streaming is very much higher for the 16 to 24-year-olds. 25 to 34-year-olds, then it kind of evens out the green and the red, the broadcast radio and the on-demand streaming, very similar amongst the 35 to 44-year-olds. And then as we get to 45 plus, we can see that the share that radio holds very much starts to increase for the older categories, and on-demand streaming is a lot lower. One thing that is also quite striking here is that amongst 16 to 24-year-olds, or we can see overall the highest proportion of proportional share of any of the formats is streaming amongst the 16 to 24-year-olds at 57% for on-demand streaming. In terms of the other formats, there are a couple of noteworthy differences here. So internet radio, we see for, including, for example, Pandora, for the 25 to 34-year-olds, that tends to be a little bit larger than the average, which holds out a bit later as well. And share of satellite radio and CDs skew slightly older. So lots of information to kind of look at there and in detail, and definitely as you get a chance to later, I'm sure there'll be other things of interest, but for us, that's kind of the main, we thought the main kind of things that we wanted to flag is that radio and on-demand streaming dominate for different generations. Okay, so moving on to devices. So yeah, devices used for music consumption. So no major surprises here. First of all, in terms of devices owned, we've got cell phones and smartphones are the most owned devices by some way. Laptops and televisions come in similar proportions own them. And then we've also got the breakdown here by age. So we'll see that AM and FM radio receivers have got a lot lower ownership amongst the 16 to 34-year-olds than they do the total sample. There's also something interesting in terms of younger people's consumption of video technologies and kind of connected technologies, sort of speakers, etc. Here, so that tends to be higher amongst young people. But if we look specifically at smart speakers, it's actually very much comparable to the total population, whereas wireless speakers, young people tend to have higher levels of ownership. For smart speakers, it's very much comparable, both around a quarter ownership of those. Okay, so moving then on to share of listening by device. So we see here that smartphones and cell phones very much dominate. So a quarter of listening, share of listening across devices is via those, with radio receivers coming in second and third essentially. But when we combine all radio receivers together, we see that proportion, which includes in-car radio, general radio receivers, satellite radios, etc., that comes to 33%, which is higher than the share that cell phones have alone. So, which is quite interesting. And then those two are very much the dominant formats, radio receivers and smartphones, with no other device, a single device, taking up more of a 7% share of listening. So desktops, etc., nothing was higher than 7%. Okay, getting on to online streaming here. So this again amalgamates internet radio and on-demand streaming services, also social media is covered here as well. So first of all, the weekly reach by platforms. So we can see there's a hierarchy definitely here. So this is in terms of which services do people use on a weekly basis, with YouTube to listen to music, that is, and YouTube's very much top. So approximately half of people use YouTube. And then we've got our second tier, which includes Spotify, Pandora, and iHeartRadio, coming in at around a quarter of the population using those. Okay, and then we've got the other platforms again, and then slightly behind those. So that's sort of the story of this one. Then when we look at weekly reach by age across the platform, so this is quite interesting. So we've got, for a lot of the other platforms, sort of reach tends to stay quite similar across the age groups, but for YouTube and Spotify, we see dramatic increases amongst younger age groups, and particularly spiking amongst the 16 to 24-year-olds. So that's the youngest age group overall. So we see here for YouTube, 67% reach among 16 to 24-year-olds compared to the 47% of the total population. And this sustains a fair amount, though it drops a little, it sustains quite a bit for those from 25 all the way up to 44 years of age. And then Spotify, we see a pretty major increase amongst the 16 to 24-year-olds relative to the total population. So that's 52 versus the 26%. And 25 to 34-year-olds are sort of higher than the average, but still a little away from the 16 to 24-year-olds at 37%. So Pandora, as we mentioned earlier, has that kind of, is hitting the kind of middle age groups quite well. We can see that it's 34% amongst 25 to 34-year-olds and 30% amongst 35 to 44-year-olds, which is comparable to the 24% of the total population. In terms of some of the other platforms, so though we've got reach slightly lower for Apple Music and TikTok, they both see spikes again for the younger age groups, which we thought was quite noteworthy. So 11% for Apple versus 6% total population in the 16 to 24-year-old group. And for TikTok, it's a massive, well, comparably 19% for 16 to 24-year-olds versus 7% amongst the total population. Okay, so then moving on to on-demand streaming. So this is just the platforms that we have listed here and their share of listening across age groups. So what's interesting here is there's a definite battle between YouTube and Spotify. And if we look at their combined share of listening, that's 64%. So 64% of daily listening is either across YouTube or Spotify. And that gets even higher if we look at the 16 to 24-year-old group, where it spikes to 79% total share for the two of them. Another interesting thing is when we look at age differences across the two, there's Spotify actually leapfrogs YouTube amongst the 16 to 24-year-old group before then going on to lose share, and YouTube starts to sort of comparably have a very much larger share as we get older. But that we thought was quite an interesting storyline as well to flag here. Okay, across the other platforms, share generally remains fairly consistent across the age groups. So there are some intricacies there which could be explored as well that might be of interest. Okay, so we're moving on now to our sort of bespoke topics for this year. So podcasts, which is something that we've been looking into quite a bit, and just wanted to share a few highlights there for you. So in terms of share of listening, so our earlier slide where we were looking at which activities people engage in, so we have the stats here just pulled up top in terms of the reach. So as a reminder, that's 18% of the population listen to podcasts on a typical day. So again, the time frame is quite narrow there, so that's pretty high engagement relative to that. And we see that it's notably higher amongst those aged under the age of 45. So we've got, it drops to 13% amongst 45+-year-olds, whereas the others, it's at least over a quarter. The other thing is that it's particularly high amongst, as I mentioned earlier, the young professional group of 25 to 34-year-olds, who 30% of them listen on a daily basis. In terms of platforms, so YouTube accounts for the highest share of listening with 32%, not share of listening, sorry, highest reach there. So 32% of people listen across YouTube to podcasts. Then Apple Music follows with a quarter listening that way, and Spotify just slightly behind. No other platform is currently accounting for 8% of listening, for more than 8% of listening. Okay, so then now time spent listening to podcasts. So here we've seen a rapid increase of podcast listening over the last year or so. So we've asked people in the last year, has this increase, decrease, etc. So almost, well, 70% indicated that the amount of time they spend listening to podcasts has increased in the last year, with 38% essentially saying that it increased a lot. So there definitely seems to be a lot happening, whether that's platforms now supplying more podcasts. There's definitely been a lot of movement here in the last year, though we don't have comparable data for last year, I should flag. Certainly this is pretty high, and it's especially high amongst the younger groups, so 16 to 24. Where you can see it's sort of increased a lot, is a lot higher. One thing of interest here is that, for example, the 16 to 24-year-olds, just 17% say that their time spent listening has stayed the same, compared to 26% for the total sample. And then in terms of how much time people are spending listening to podcasts on a weekly basis this time, so here the magic number is sort of tends to be 3 hours. So we've got an even split between those, well, 3 and upwards of 3 hours, who spend less than 3 hours, and those that spend more than 3 hours. That kind of seems to be the sort of threshold, or sort of average, it would seem, time that people are spending. Types of genres. So we found this one really quite interesting. Again, a new area for us to explore, but the top 2 genres are pretty opposite, in the sense that you've got comedy on the one hand, which, you know, quite fun and probably light-hearted, maybe escapist in many ways. And then we have news and current affairs also selected. It's kind of comes out as one of the most listened to genres. However, when we ask people what their favorite one is, then we see comedy is selected more. So it could be that there are just more listeners of those genres, but we something we want to investigate in a little bit more detail next year, or kind of as we sort of drill down further in this research. Okay, moving now on to world music. So world music is a particular passion area of mine, one of my sort of specialisms. So really, you know, excited to share this data and hope it's of interest. So starting off, so we ask here, I should say, with world music, we ask about world sounds, so music that sounds or inspired by different origins but isn't necessarily in a different language, as well as music specifically asking about music in a different language. So first thing here, we see looking at level of interest in world music and sounds and how that has increased in the last 2 years. So approximately a third indicated that the interest in world music had increased in the last 2 years, and this is notably higher amongst the 16 to 44-year-old group. So this is again another one of our stories that world music engagement is very much higher amongst 16 to 44-year-olds when compared to the others. But the good thing there is that it does sustain for quite a few across quite a few age groups. So then when we look at interest in different languages, encouragingly, this is only just slightly lower than general interest in world music. So we see here interest in listening to music that's not in your native language increased 26% of people. And again, this is higher among 16 to 34-year-olds, where it ranged between 34 and 39%. Okay, looking then at the origins of world music and areas that are of interest to people. So we see three kind of origins that really stand out. So Latin America, European and Caribbean sounds. And then when we look across age groups, it's sort of fairly comparable. The one thing that really jumps out here is probably just a very interesting kind of fun story, is the interest in Southeast Asian genres amongst young people. So 16 to 24-year-olds, that spikes to 28% relative to the average there of 14%. So interest in genres like K-pop, etc. Okay, so now moving on to broad attitudes to world music. So the good news here is that world music is seen as bringing value to the industry. There appears to be appreciation and respect for world music and its contribution. And so where we've asked for agreement with a couple of statements. So the first one is that world sounds are changing music for the better, which a third of the sample agreed with. And again, a lot higher amongst younger groups. As the 16 to 44-year-olds, that level of agreement raised to almost half, or kind of just under half. And then agreement with world sounds are the future of music was around, well, just over a quarter, 29%. So, and that rose by 7 to 9% again amongst the 16 to 44-year-old age group. Okay, then looking at the sort of how will this impact, if at all, how much people listen to world music, and we've got, in terms of increased likelihood to listen to world music in general in the next few years. So a third agreed with that they'd be likely to listen to that, rising to 41 to 47% amongst 16 to 44-year-olds. And encouragingly, that proportion of around a third sustained for when we asked specifically about likelihood to listen to music in non-native languages, which was 31%. Agreement there, rising to 42 to 44% amongst those younger age categories. Okay, and then so finally, please do ask questions. I know I've run through a lot of that quite quickly. We're moving on to our final section now, which is music and mental health. So just to take a second to say, this has kind of been something that we've been wanting to look into for some time now, because a lot of our research across the globe and in the UK, there's a lot that comes out where people are talking about how music is fundamental to their life and how they don't know what they would do about it, how it's like a best friend that's always there for them to pick them up. So with that in mind, we wanted to investigate it in a little bit more detail. So how does music impact positive mental health? So to start off with, we asked people how often, if at all, do they feel stressed or anxious. Now, I also want to caveat this with, we weren't asking about more acute conditions such as depression and anxiety themselves, but this is more feelings of stress and anxiety kind of on a frequent level, or how often do people feel that way. So over half said that they feel stressed or anxious on a weekly basis, with as many as 22% here we see saying they feel that way on a daily basis. So the thing to say here is it's very much a day-to-day occurrence for people, and something that they kind of have to manage, daily essentially, or weekly, and manage their emotions or manage those feelings. And what contributes to stress, or why is it such a kind of day-to-day thing? Well, we found that the 4 big contributors are very much sort of universal. So things that I suppose most of us can't escape, but finances, work, physical health, and family, with approximately 1 in 4 also feeling stressed and anxious about mental health itself. So we then went on to ask people what strategies, tools, and techniques do they use in order to help them feel less stressed and anxious. So the good news is that people do have strategies in place, with just 5%, a very small proportion, saying that they didn't use any of the ones we tested. We'll come on to those in a second, the broader list, but the kind of main thing to say here is that it's tools and techniques or activities that enable people to escape or that release endorphins that are commonly used. So we've got music. 69% of people relied on music as a tool when wanting to reduce feelings of stress and anxiety. We've also got pretty high proportions of 42% turning to films and TV shows, and over a third, so a 37%, exercising. Okay, so here's our broader list that we have, and as we can see, as I mentioned, music at 69%, so it comes in as our top tool or technique used to help reduce feelings of stress and anxiety. So we can see quite a way ahead of the next ones, and as we go down, it kind of reduces more. Playing video games is at 22%. Of course, this data is really rich, and we could cut it by a range of different things, so age groups or level of stress and anxiety, but definitely as a key headline, and it came out for us that music listening was very high. Though we'd hypothesized, I suppose we didn't necessarily realize it would be so prevalent, especially when up against some of the other things like talking to friends and family, etc. It could be, as I mentioned, the earlier point, where music is just a ongoing thing that people have with them constantly throughout the day, so it's perhaps a thing that they feel they can rely on. So yeah. Then when we ask people to pick their top 3, again, just to contextualize, so out of their top 3, over half selected music within their top 3, and 25% selected music as their top 1. So again, coming back here, so with all the other things, people selected music as their top go-to to help reduce feelings of stress and anxiety, which feels, again, definitely a significant number and very interesting. Looking then at what music helps with, so we had a range of different statements that fell into some themes. So here are some of those that we'll run you by. So 90% of people agreed that they turn to music because it helps to lift their mood when they're feeling down, with almost half strongly agreeing. So the mood enhancement theme was our most agreed with one overall, so I'm a kind of dominant one, if you will, that came out. Also, escape, very close behind as well. 84% agreed that listening to music helps them escape and forget about their problems and their stresses. So linking that to our earlier point about wanting to kind of shut themselves off or just switch off for a little bit to then be able to tackle their problems, here with 43% strongly agreeing with this statement. Then in terms of resilience, so things that help people feel like they can cope with whatever they might be going through. Again, quite high engagement here or agreement here. So over 3/4 agreed with the statements relating to resilience. So feeling more motivated or feeling that actually without music, they would feel more stressed or anxious. Confidence, sort of similarly, feeling better about music, helping them feel better about their own ability to manage their stresses and anxieties. Definitely an important one there at 76%, also pretty high in terms of agreement. And then just generally boosting their self-confidence. 69% agreed with that. Empathy. So this was, though it was a bit lower in terms of the agreement, still pretty high, but lower when compared to the other themes. But we have over half saying that music inspires them through hearing about other people's stories, and that music gives them courage. Now, it's interesting that both our, well, certainly perhaps a bit higher in our UK data, but our UK and US data is showing that this is higher amongst younger people, so the 16 to 24-year-old age groups. That's something we'll be investigating in a little bit more detail, but certainly the theme of empathy seems to, the music, facilitating empathy is slightly higher amongst them. So how is music used? So this was something that was interesting and I think surprising. We've had a lot of people kind of asking us a few questions around this, or sort of how it compares to perhaps some other data that's out there. So we asked people here, what do they listen to essentially when they're wanting to bring down their stress and anxiety? And they tend to gravitate towards their favorite things, so be it their favorite artists, their favorite songs, their own playlist. So it seems it's about a bit more about control, as opposed to necessarily more generic things such as inspirational songs or playlists created by platforms for mood uplifts and stuff. Again, a caveat here being we're asking specifically about those in the moment stresses and anxieties, more so than the prevention perhaps that people might use other things or playlists, etc. for. So if you are making like-for-like comparisons, I just wanted to flag that ours is very much situational, and therefore might not quite tie up with some of the others, but please feel free to ask questions. More than happy to kind of delve a bit deeper in this one. So then finally, for us to sum up here is on the mental health and music stuff, is to say that managing stress and anxiety is very much a day-to-day process for most people, and they tend to have tools and techniques to enable them to deal with this, which is positive news. And it's about distracting themselves and trying to boost their morale. And excitingly for us, or very much positively we hope for the industry, is that music is the most commonly used way to manage and reduce the kind of technique that a lot of people turn to. So certainly when we embarked on this bit of research, we were hopeful that we can help to kind of create awareness about that, so that more people that might not be using music, or perhaps less consciously, that are interested in music, might be able to sort of take that up as well as a way to kind of help them manage day-to-day stresses and anxieties. So that's us. I think I might have finished a little quicker than I had anticipated, but hoping that was useful. And I can, Nicole, we can open up to questions if we're ready to.
All right, so everybody, your questions box is on your screen. If you have a question about the information that Sania went through, please do type your questions into the questions box. There is one here, Sania, that asked if the slides are going to be available afterwards for those who are watching today. And I just wanted to say that we do put these webinars in the recorded version on our website. And if you have a MusicBiz email address and password, you can log into the website and re-watch this there.
Yes, and we were discussing that we should be able to share the slides as well. So if people just want those digitally, we'll get back to you on that, but that shouldn't be a problem.
And we have a question that just came in too that says, what are some of the excitements you have about the Google Home promo currently running?
Oh, the excitement. We're talking about the Google Home promo currently running. Us generally as a company. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of change at the minute. We're seeing with, I suppose, voice devices, or if you look at the new streaming services, certainly what we see in a lot of stuff is the way people consume entertainment, or there are lots of options at the minute, and I think that's great. I think a lot of people are starting, there is a sense where people are needing to make choices about which streaming platforms they maybe go to, or which voice device, etc. Because there seems, at least from some of our research, they're now starting to be concerned a little bit about budgets and their spending on music and entertainment, especially because I suppose they're used to sort of consuming a lot digitally and where it's a little bit cheaper. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that, because I think it'll be really interesting about the Google Home stuff. But at this research, sadly, we've not managed to cover too much, but we do know that voice devices are definitely used in a really interesting way by people in terms of the music they listen to and the situations. And so, yeah, we should explore that in a little bit more detail maybe next time.
The next one here, Sania says, do you see radio surviving this new audio ecosystem if it doesn't innovate and allow for music discovery again?
That's a really interesting one. I think with us, what we're finding really interesting is the increase in podcasting, which suggests that people do still want some sort of conversational content, or some kind of, perhaps, maybe just listening by streaming, they might feel that they're missing a bit of interaction. So I don't know, with streaming services having their own podcasts and stuff like that might fill that gap. But I think it's a tricky one. I think it's definitely one for us to watch out for, because a lot of people are listening to online radio and things. So I don't know. There seems to be a bit of change going on at the minute, which we should keep our eye on. I've not really answered that one conclusively, but I think there is this now increase in wanting spoken content as well. One thing we're really interested in is looking at how podcasts, if they start to eat into the share of time spent listening to music, especially as we identified that young professional group. Are they going to be listening to less music or more, that kind of thing? So definitely something we'll look at.
It's funny you should kind of end in that way, because the question that just came through says, do you feel podcasts are a threat to music content streaming services?
Yeah, really, really interesting there. Well, I think especially the stuff we've done on music and mental health, where we realize it's just really fun. Music is fundamental to people, their day to day, how they're living their lives, how it is essentially like their best friend that goes around with them in their pocket, wherever it might be. So I think podcasts will certainly have their space, and we can see that they are, or maybe people are listening in the mornings or in the evenings on the commute from home, but not necessarily at nighttime, where they might want music to relax them. So I think they'll definitely carve out their niche and their time. Whether music listening still maintains the amount of time they listen to music, we'll have to kind of look into around that. Essentially, they might still spend a lot of time listening to music, but then podcasts might take over time spent watching TV or something. So it might threaten something else, not necessarily music, but definitely, again, something we're going to be looking into.
This one here says, can local artists help navigate radio again, making music discovery part of radio again, and trying into local
Flying into the local community. We've got one from Mark. You know what? So I'm a huge radio fan. Luckily, in the UK, there's a station that I go on a bit, so I'm always championing radio, and especially with the South Asian community, where perhaps this is interesting because it is more of a smaller niche community, and radio is very much central to how people discover new artists and engage with them. So yeah, maybe something that's a little bit more locally specific to help differentiate it to some of the platforms could certainly be something that helps radio kind of ascend again.
Do you think international genres can grow in the US, Bollywood, etc.?
Oh, that is one of my favorite questions. Yes, I'm very hopeful. Certainly, our data is very encouraging, especially with the younger audiences. And as I mentioned, it's sustaining all the way up to 44. And even when we're looking at music in a different language. So yeah, our global research that we're doing does show that music has no language, music has no borders, and people are consuming, especially with the whole boost in K-pop. And excitingly for me, there's a new Bollywood fusion track, which is Bhangra, and UK grime hip hop, which has been trending #1 on YouTube in the music. So it does feel like there's a shift and people will start to engage with it. But I think maybe big collaborations could be a big part of that. So where we had the whole Despacito effect, which was the Latin and American markets coming together. So if we can see a few more of those, hopefully it will increase engagement and attention on international genres, which definitely doesn't seem to be happening anyway.
Well, wonderful. I think that's the last question that we have in the queue. I see that your email address is up there, so any of you who have questions, following the webinar, think of something once we end here. Sonia's email address is here. Feel free to reach out to her. I thank you all for being on the Common Ground webinar series this afternoon. I hope to see you back here in the coming weeks. And Sania, we hope to get you an AudienceNet back on the Common Ground webinar again soon as well.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.